Well, good afternoon, good morning, and for our guests joining us from Germany, good evening. On behalf of the American Friends of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation and our partner, the American Council on Germany, I welcome you to our Humboldt Dialogue, Transatlantic Backroads, Finding Common Ground in Rural Germany and the United States. My name is Christian Hähne. I'm president and CEO of the American Friends of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. We're based in Washington, D.C., and our mission is to promote collaboration in science and research between the United States and Germany. As the American partner of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, our primary role is to engage with the incredible network of nearly 6,000 Humboldtians across the United States. Humboldtians are the alumni of the Humboldt Fellowship programs, brilliant American researchers and professionals who cross the Atlantic to work on pressing issues relevant to both our societies, issues like public health, energy security, AI governance, just to name a few. These 6,000 American alumni are part of a global network of over 30,000 Humboldtians worldwide. We're truly delighted to have not one, but two Humboldtians with us on today's panel, Dr. Jenny Reardon, our main speaker, and Dr. Dale Medearis, our moderator. Jenny, thank you so much for being with us. We're very much looking forward to being inspired by your work and your commitment to fostering transatlantic exchange. Dale will introduce you properly in just a moment. A few words about Dale first. Since 2007, Dale Medearis has served as a senior regional planner at the Northern Virginia Regional Commission, NVRC, a regional council of governments representing 13 counties, cities, and towns in Northern Virginia. He helps manage NVRC's climate, energy, sustainability, waste, and international programs. From 1994 to 1995, Dale was a fellow of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation in Bonn, Germany, an experience he describes in his own words as having totally and profoundly shaped his life. Before that, from 1988 to 2007, he spent nearly 2 decades at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Office of International Affairs, working on programs involving Western Europe, the OECD, the Middle East, science and research, and the urban environment. Dale grew up in Northern California in one of Silicon Valley's first solar passive homes built by his father, a Kansas native, who married a native of Wiesbaden, Germany. That rich German-American background inspired Dale to reach out to Jenny after reading her article in the Washington Post earlier this year. Dale is someone who gets stuff done, tackling complex challenges and solving problems at the regional and local levels. He's a champion of practical collaboration and mutual learning between American and German cities and states. At a time when transatlantic relations are facing headwinds at the federal level, subnational cooperation continues to thrive and to deliver real results. We learned so much through these regional and local transatlantic networks, and indeed, we get stuff done. This approach is also a key part of the strategy of our valued partner, the American Council on Germany. I'm delighted that ACG's president and CEO, Dr. Stephen Sokol, is with us today and will be offering closing remarks later. Steve, thank you. And thanks to your team at ACG for your partnership. I look forward to working with you on this and many more events in the future. With that, I wish all of us an engaging and insightful discussion. Thank you very much, and over to you, Dale.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much, Christian. Thank you, Jenny, for taking time from your busy schedule, getting up early on the West Coast to be with us. And special thanks to Steve, who I've known for so many years, has been such a close friend, along and all the staff at the American Friends of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. I just feel so blessed by the privileges that I've always had as a Humboldtian, and this is no exception. I'm going to get a little bit mushier and just say the when I read Jenny's article in January of this year. It was like a bolt of lightning because it was titled on Kansas Backroads. I found people who are solving problems. Their past, quote, what's the matter with Kansas, end quote, are finding common ground. And it started off Jenny Reardon, who grew up in Lenexa, Kansas, a professor of sociology at the University of California at Santa Cruz and founding director of the University's Science and Justice Research Center. And it hit me like a bolt of lightning because I was grieving. I recently returned from California and the funeral of my father. My mother passed 7 years ago. And I think when I was reading the article, I was grieving not only the loss of family, but the loss of common ground that I think sort of characterizes the political and landscape of the country. And the further I read Jenny's work, the more life that I found into it, the more enthusiasm, the more excitement, the more effervescence that I found within inside myself. And I thought to myself, um, I, I have to do something about this because this is just too good. And in particular, there was a line in the article where she talks about Kansas being a flyover state. And one of Christian's favorite expressions is that within the Humboldtian community, there are no flyover states. Um, and then when I read that Jenny was a Humboldtian, I thought, God, my mom and dad must be screaming for me to try to do something. Because I read her biography, which I feel obligated to share, because it embodies the Renaissance spirit of Humboldt and all that we are and where we can go, especially combined with the story that she has to share with her bike rides, not just across Kansas, but also across Europe. So let me read to you Jenny's bio. Jenny Reardon is a professor of sociology and the founding director of the Science and Justice Research Center at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Her research draws into focus questions about identity, justice, and democracy that are often silently embedded in scientific ideas and practices, particularly in modern genomic research. Her training spans molecular biology, the history of biology, science studies, feminist and critical race studies, and the sociology of science, technology, and medicine. She's the author of Race to the Finish, Identity and Governance in an Age of Genomics, and The Post-Genomic Condition, Ethics, Justice, Knowledge After the Genome. She's been the recipient of fellowships and awards from, among others, the National Science Foundation, the Max Planck Institute, the Humboldt Foundation, the Technical University of Munich, the Westinghouse Science Talent Search, and the U.S. Congressional Committee on Science, Space, and Technology. So I want to now put on my Robert Siegel hat and by saying, Jenny, again, thank you so much. Um, it's just been such a joy to have had the conversations we had with you and the others building up to this. I want to ask you, why did you decide to bike from London to Berlin in the summer of 2016?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for Dale for reaching out. One of the great pleasures of writing that piece in the Post was making connections with people all over the country and now making these transnational connections. And I'm actually in Germany right now, so embodying the transnational spirit here. So I decided to do that ride. It was in 2016. It's somewhat of a whimsical idea. I was having dinner with friends, and I was saying, well, I need to be in London for one thing this summer, and I need to be in Berlin for something this summer. I got to get from A to B. How about I go on a bike ride? And it seemed like a completely crazy idea. This was before Brexit had happened. But somehow by saying it, I committed myself to doing it. Um, and, um, and then Brexit happened. And I didn't realize what kind of brilliance there was in that plan. And I had spent, almost nearly a decade partially living in the United Kingdom and felt heartbroken about the Brexit decision. I also grew up during the time of the Cold War and the fall of the wall. and the fall of borders and the creation of the European Union had really been formative in my life. And to experience a vote like that felt like something dying in me. But bike rides always cheer me up. They're always a space of adventure. And they also have a way of generating stories and stories, as Hannah Arendt, a German political philosopher and public figure who really inspires me, and also Donna Haraway, an American public figure and thinker, make this point that stories are vital to political life. They bring us together. They make connections across differences, and the bike and the bike riding certainly did that. So that was the reason why I did the London to Berlin ride, and there's a lot more to say about that. But once I had done London to Berlin, your next question might be, why Kansas? But once I had done London to Berlin and understood just how much you could learn on the back of a bike, when Trump was elected in fall of 2016, much to the surprise of many people, I decided, maybe I need to get back on that bike. And so thus launched the crazy project of biking around my home state of Kansas.
Share with us some of the stories that go beyond that which you wrote in the post article, but in particular, how they relate to this, not just the search for common ground, but the finding of common ground.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think both of the bike rides, what they did for me, and I think what I was hoping for in the post article when I wrote that, was it opened up stories that I would have never known about, people and places and efforts that just weren't making the national news. I mean, one of the things that's happened in the US, I'm less clear about what that I'd be interested to know from Christian and Steve, how this has played out in Germany. But over the last several decades, the support for local media has really declined in the US. And so what we were hearing and what one hears, and increasingly because of social media, are like the same old stories, like the same national news stories that get circulated and we don't hear the stories of on the ground, what's going on locally. And often those things are very surprising stories. On any given day, I was figuring things out that I would have never known about, both good and sometimes very difficult. Like the day in Germany when I somehow stumbled upon the chicken slaughter capital of Europe. I was stopping for lunch, and at a local a guy whose family had emigrated from Turkey to the northern Rhineland, and had made my lunch, and I was trying to figure out how to gracefully ask him why the place smelled so bad. He told me about Wiesenhof, which is the largest slaughterhouse. It's a chicken, company that processes chicken, and the largest slaughterhouse, I think, in Europe is there. And thus the smell. And this is the kind of large scale like 27,000 chickens an hour get killed at this factory. And that kind of large scale agriculture that was happening was also something I was finding there was resistance to on the ground. So the next day when I ended my day at staying at the home of somebody in the Wendland, in Germany, which is a bit of Germany known as the nose of Germany, where West Germany stuck into East Germany because of the way the Elbe it goes down at a slant. And because of this, very few people wanted to live in that part of West Germany up until the Cold War, because you couldn't cross the border. And so local modes of agriculture persisted there longer than in other areas. And people there were telling me this is the problem with the EU, is that we're imposed upon us these large macro industrial agricultural systems, and we really would like more local control over agriculture. There was I heard a lot about GMOs. And I didn't know about this, like from perspective of being someone from the US, just hearing about Brexit, these issues about local control over land were not ones that I was hearing about. And those are very much similar to what I was hearing in Kansas, where in Kansas, the big issue in Kansas, we also had big ag in Kansas in the western part of the state. 20% of all agriculture, or 20% of all cattle that are processed in the United States, that happens in western Kansas. And the reason for that is that there's something called the Ogallala Aquifer. And the Ogallala Aquifer is the largest body of water, underground body of water in the US. And beginning in the 1950s, farmers started to pump that water up and use it to fuel agriculture. And so corn now can grow in that part of the state where they used to not be able to grow it, because that part of Kansas is also in a rain shadow from the Rocky Mountains. So it gets very little water. It's actually in a desert environment. But because of the pumping systems, they've been able to pump up the water in the Ogallala Aquifer and create big ag out in western Kansas. But now that water is famously running out, and there's lots of debates and struggles in Kansas over who should be controlling that water and how those decisions should be made. And should the government in eastern Kansas, the capital of Kansas is in Topeka, be making decisions about what's happening in western Kansas? Who has a say over this land and this water? And so these fights over who controls, and the idea of this imagined community out there, this abstract big government out there that's controlling us, and we want local control. These are common problems, I think, across Germany and Kansas, as I was finding. But I was also finding that what was making a difference was FaceTime, people showing up and actually meeting each other and talking to each other and listening to one another. And I think what people really loved about meeting me on my bike was the curiosity I showed for what was happening locally. And that became a generator of conversations. There was a local legislator that I met, Lindsey Vaughn, who I mentioned in the article, who made a big difference by traveling from Topeka out to western Kansas and meeting with people there, and did what I thought was not possible in Kansas, which was to help pass legislation that's reforming how water is being governed in Kansas. So those sorts of, on the ground, there's lots of other stories I could tell you about, people I met and about the unexpected stories, both around questions around water, but also about questions around immigration. That was another, issue I think that connects the two places, is the struggle over who belongs on the land. And I could say more about that, but I'll give you a chance to jump in, Dale, in case something I said made you want to follow up.
No, I was just really curious because this issue of finding common ground, right, that leads to solutions. Your work that you characterized in the article, or the experiences you had biking across Kansas, found that there's this profound opportunity when people drop their defaults in narrow, personal, intimate contexts. And I wanted to ask if, putting on my transatlantic Humboldtian hat, if you took those chicken farmers that I'm assuming their families, their neighbors, also have concerns about water quality, groundwater quality, in Brandenburg. And if you brought them together with their counterparts that are concerned about the Ogallala aquifers depletion,
Mhm.
what kinds of common ground do you think that they would find, assuming that there was adequate translation? But what kinds of ideas do you think that they'd be able to share that they could bring home? The guys from Kansas listening to whatever the guys from Brandenburg had to share, and vice versa. Or if we were able to take the guys from Kansas to Brandenburg, if we were able to structure something that Steve does so well,
Well,
bring people together, what do you think that they would swap? What ideas that would actually lead to change getting done could we imagine?
It's interesting. I think there's similarities and differences. I don't know, and it's interesting your use of what would the guys think, because it's true that in Western Kansas, the people who've sat on these water boards for a long, long time have almost always been all men. And that is now changing. One thing I highlighted in my article is one thing in Kansas that I think is working right now is that you have a group of women leaders who have led the charge on changing some of this water governance and who put a focus on building new relations. And I don't want to, stereotype, go into gender stereotypes. But I do think, introducing different kinds of leaders into the space and creating a space for openness to new ideas is really important in this moment, however we do it. Because the Alton Vega is not necessarily going to work in these challenging times that are presenting problems that are both old problems, but they're also new ones. So the scale of the problems, the Ogallala is running out. Like we've never encountered that problem before. That's a first in time, kind of problem. We weren't pumping the water in the Ogallala until, 70 years ago. And so we didn't have to face this problem before. And so it's hard to introduce new ideas. It's hard to get people to move off of their ideas that we've had for 50 years, water governance has worked like this in Kansas. So maybe there would be a way in which, one could exchange new ideas about what's being tried, like new modes. I know in Germany, you have different regions, and the way Germany post-war was put together, was intentionally to distribute power, to try to ensure that power did not get centralized. But when you're dealing with macro level issues like how are we going to provide energy for all the people in Germany, or how are we going to provide water for all, clean water, as you point out, Dale, not just water, but clean water, then that means you have to be focused on what is like creating collectivities, a sense of identity that transcends the local level and connects people, because waterways, they're not just local, they move. One of the interesting things about water, I think, is that, especially rivers, maybe not lakes, but rivers, is that they move. And so the constituencies and the people who have a say or have an interest in water span local communities. And I think that there would be a lot, I think, that could be shared between Germany and people in Germany and people in Kansas over those challenges of how do you create, like, do the people in I was just hearing this weekend about, and energy is another one of these things. Energy is produced locally. Somewhere, somebody has to deal with a power plant. Whether or not it's coal or it's nuclear or it's wind, it's having local impact. And yet the power is being distributed beyond the local. And so, will the people of, Grunwald, for example, outside of Munich, identify and want to share their power with the people of Munich, right? So that is the kind of question, I think, that transcends these borders. And I think on the ground, people are coming up with interesting, ways of solving that problem. So in Kansas, they're transforming how who has a vote, on the water. Like, who should be able to, what are the governing bodies? And, we have in Kansas a system where up until very recently, it was just people who owned at least for a certain amount of land and had that land in productive agriculture, which has a specific definition as well. And now that idea is being challenged because if the water runs out, it's not just the people who are producing, who are like growing the corn or the wheat that are going to suffer. It's going to be the people in those towns. And so there were people who I met along the way who said to me, if that water runs out, there will be no town. And so they are now piloting different mechanisms or different ideas about who votes. And also, how does that vote happen? Do you have to come to a place? Do you have to actually be there? Can you do mail-in ballots? All this stuff is being discussed at this time. Water quality, I think, probably is the one, because in Germany, I think there's less of a sense that there's like water's running out, but it's more about water quality. I think that that's definitely a shared concern across the two places. So I think one might learn from local experiments, what's being tried. And I think that would be amazing if we could have more of that. Like one of the things that I'm hoping comes out of our conversations is linking up, local efforts, which I know more about in Kansas, because I've basically focused a lot of my efforts on what's going on in Kansas around environmental issues, around care of the land. But I'm hoping through the Humboldtian network, we might, find, places that could have an exchange. And there's a history of this. There was an effort in Kansas, there are prairie lands in Kansas, and there was an effort in the 80s to save the tallgrass prairie. And part of that effort entailed people in Germany got interested in that effort, interestingly enough. And people came over from Kansas to Germany to have dialogues about a prairie. This was just when there were people in Germany who were getting interested in their grasslands, like kind of challenging the idea that the only like plants we should be caring about in our gardens were like flowers and trees, but the grasses really mattered too. And so there is a history of these exchanges, and I think now might be another good time to be watering those roots and making new types of exchanges happen.
Yeah, as you were talking, I was reminded of the focus you gave in the article in your work on water. Water's so vital, it's so important. And at the same time, I realized too that particularly in your pieces involving transatlantic backroads, you talked a little bit about wind. And if I'm not mistaken, Kansas, I think, is in the top 3 of producers of wind energy in the United States. It might even be number 2 behind Texas.
Yeah.
I just returned from Berlin a couple of days ago where I was with a team of my energy planner. We're working on data centers and ways in which, this demand for energy as a result of the digital economy is just going to explode. And I know that wind is kind of controversial in parts of Brandenburg and parts of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, but I wanted to ask whether you saw opportunities maybe for some acceptance of wind in both states, whether ironically the folks in Kansas may go over to Brandenburg and say, hey, this is pretty good stuff. I think you could learn to live with it.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting question. I was thinking about this a week ago when I was out here in Bavaria, and I was out biking, and there were some wind farms, and I wondered, because this region is so known for its natural beauty, people come here to go hiking, and I did wonder if there was a similar issue as there has been in Kansas, where in the Flint Hills of Kansas, there was a big push to build wind farms, partly because it was close to the cities that could use the energy. And so one of the issues is, producing wind power, close to where you're going to use it, because it's expensive and you lose the energy if you're transporting it across long lines. But the Flint Hills of Kansas, which is where they wanted to put it, was also trying to market itself as like the prairie of Kansas. And so you're like interfering, one type of economy is interfering with another type of economy. So the tourism industry bumping up against this desire to put in wind energy. Now, this was before AI and before the big now push to be producing, energy that is being driven by AI. When I was last in Kansas, well, not last in Kansas, but when I was in Kansas last fall and I was out in Western Kansas, one of the ideas about how to deal with the water running out was wind power. And even though Western Kansas is way away from, it's one, I think the third most remote area in Kansas, or not in Kansas, but in the nation. And that is measured by how close you are to a city of over 50,000 people. And there is not a city of 50,000 people until you get to Denver or you get to Wichita. It's remote. And so you do have the challenge, as I was, noting, of transporting the energy then. But I think with the demand in energy increasing, and also under the Biden administration, there had been a lot of, support for wind energy. People who I thought would not be for wind energy were for wind energy. And they were concerned about the election. This was before the election, because they were concerned that support for wind energy would go away in this new, with this new government. And I've been really eager to reconnect to see how things are going. But I think there's more openness to wind now than there has been in Kansas, but it varies locally, and it varies depending on what the other competing issues are. For example, if you're trying to save the prairie chicken, which is a much beloved bird. I don't know if do you know what prairie chicken is, Dale? I don't know if anybody knows what a prairie chicken is. It's one of the most ancient birds on the planet. It's been around 6 million years. It has this amazing dance and calls that it does. There are these things called booming grounds, and where the prairie chickens fly in early in the morning. It's like the bar for prairie chickens. It's where they get together and mate. And there's been an effort to save the prairie chickens. Now, the prairie chickens do not like wind farms, because the one thing that eats a prairie chicken is a hawk. And a turbine looks like a tree, so they're not going to go anywhere near a turbine. So if you are trying to cultivate and bring back the prairie, and one of the signs of a healthy prairie is prairie chickens, then you're not going to want to put in wind farms. So, and there's not just environmental reasons for bringing back the prairie, there's also economic reasons for bringing back the prairie. Again, going back to the tourism issue. So I do think that, again, these conversations across different spaces, it's very specific locally. What's going on? What are the interests of people in those places? And that's in tension with what, say, the government wants, or what, say, industry wants. And it's not just like the governments of Germany or the European Union. It's like, what does Meta want? Or what does ChatGPT want, right? So one thing that's happening right now is big battery plant is being built in Kansas. That's also another thing in, like who's being successful at building batteries, and how does that work? And in Kansas right now, we just got a big contract to build a battery plant in Kansas. So that's those agendas are coming not from locally from Kansas. They're coming from this larger, global economic space.
Before I turn things over to Steve for a question, I got one last question. I'm going to exercise the prerogative of the moderator, because my mother's DNA in the strict accounting of time is starting to kick in.
Yeah.
But can you share with us your own sort of expectations about how more of these common spaces could be created in both countries, but in particular through the kinds of journeys that you took and the kinds of convening of equivalents that you've just discussed? I need some more hope in light of all the sad news over the last couple of months.
Yeah, I know. And we are talking in a different political moment that Dale than when we first started talking.
Yeah.
And that's a whole other conversation. But I'll tell you one thing. I've been having conversations that started in Kansas, but are also starting to prop up here about using teaching. So like starting classes with students in California and in Kansas, like so partnering with a faculty member at University of Kansas and teaching a course on the back of a bike to students. So I would love to do that. This is like one of my dreams is to be able to teach from the back of a bike. I think it would be amazing. Now, there's challenges here. One of the things I've thought about in this methodology is not everyone can bike, but also we've had a real proliferation of bike technology, but this is a whole other topic we could get into. So biking has become so much more accessible to people because of e-bikes or tri bikes or all kinds of different bikes that allow people to bike, all kinds of people with all kinds of bodies to bike. And so I'm really into this idea of in the case of the first example I mentioned, it's California and Kansas students get to know each other, right? So the class is going to bring, and those states are connected. Like as you know, your father moved. I mean, I don't know exactly the story, but moved from Kansas to California. There were people, not as many as, people say, but a lot of people did leave Kansas to go to California during the Dust Bowl. And there is a connection between those two states. Also, the way in California, water is also running out. It's also has similar problems agriculturally. It's a hub of agriculture. So I think it would be an amazing thing to have students who could, have that sense of adventure. I did take a student to Kansas in the spring, and the student loved it. And I just think, and then I've been talking about doing this with my colleagues here in Munich, doing some joint teaching. I think that could, like, I do think that the young amongst us are our hope, and they are not, they are not. I mean, I think they have a lot of energy and ideas and spirit, and we have to channel that. And that's, the best of being an educator is having, for their whole lifetime, you get to engage with the youth, and so that would be one of my answers.
I would love to help out with that. I would be happy to bike one of these days. It'd have to be an e-bike, but
Yeah. See, no, e-bikes. That's a bike.
Steve.
Yes, thank you for bringing me in as well. I'm also an avid cyclist, Jenny. I biked across the U.S., including across Kansas, and did a lot of touring in Europe as well. And what you were saying about sort of meeting people and learning their interests, what their interests are, what their issues are, and engaging in conversation with them. I certainly found that that was the case when I traveled by bike because I was moving more slowly.
Hmm.
And we have a question from somebody in the audience who wants to know how you make connections differently by traveling by bike across Kansas and whether you couldn't have made some of the same connections if you had been driving but avoiding main, highways, or if you had traveled by train. I think that this, biking narrative is one that's worth talking about a little bit more.
Yeah, no. Okay, so I think all of those ways are ways you can meet people, but the specific things that biking brings, offers or affords is, for one thing, it's not actually easy to bike around Kansas. So it's just different from biking across Kansas. I mean, I'm kind of biking in circles like an idiot rather than biking across. And there are not regular places to stay. If you're in a car, you just drive to the next hotel. If you're on a bike, there may not be anywhere to stay. And so you have to carefully think about your route, and there may not be anything to eat either. One of the things I've learned is about food deserts in Kansas. Local grocery stores that are closing. It impacted me. The Last Chance store in Council Grove, Kansas, got its name back in the 19th century because it was the last point on the Oregon Trail, before you know, you left there and that was it. That was the last store. Well, it was also the last store for me in 2000 and whatever it was, 19. There was no grocery store for the next 3 days because the one grocery store that did exist closed, had just recently closed, and it had been a big struggle. Local people had really fought to keep the grocery store. At the end of the day, it was too many resources to keep that one grocery store going in this part of Kansas where the whole county only has 3,000 people in it. So it's not a rural county, it's a frontier. There's actually a different designation. And these places, you know, you learn about the actual physical struggle of living in these places. And I think one of the frustrations that one hears is that people who live in cities don't get it. You know, they don't have to experience that. And so by being on a bike, you do experience that. And then you experience people's generosity. You know, there were so many times when people would offer me, you know, do you want something to eat? You know, do you need, or do you need a place to stay? There were times when I was concerned about my own safety. Kansas is also a place where there's tornadoes and thunderstorms. And one thing I learned is that you do not bike in Kansas in May. That's when the most number of tornadoes are. You also do not bike in Kansas before 3 p.m. I mean, sorry, after 3 p.m., because that's when most of the thunderstorms and tornadoes are. So you're learning about the climate, about the geography, and you're making connections to people because you're trying to do one thing, which is to bike from A to B, which is not an easy task. You also, you know, you just like, there was the one day when I stopped on the side of the road to rest, and some other, like, during the time I was biking, there's certain seasons in Kansas where the young cattle are being taken off the land. And I won't go into all the details of how we raise cattle in the US, but many of them come to Kansas to eat grass during the spring, and then they're taken off the land in the fall. And so there's a lot of truck drivers there. They come from all over the place to drive these cattle. And I just happened to run into this guy who was taking a break too. And I had a chance to just talk to him about, well, he was really interested in me because he loves to bike. I was interested in him because I didn't know anything about like transporting cattle. And so we had this great exchange about like how we were each, you know, traveling that day. It would have never happened, you know, if I had been in a car. You know, it's just roadside. Yeah.
That totally resonates with me. You know, being invited to spend a night on an Indian reservation because a storm was coming. I mean, what you're talking about in terms of the generosity that people show,
Yeah.
but also the way in which a bike can serve as a conversation starter for people who are just curious about, hey, what are you doing? You know, we don't get that many cyclists who are coming through here. But I thought it was interesting, you know, the portion of the conversation that you and Dale were having about things like water and wind, which are controversial in some areas and where there are different perspectives, of course. You know, what you were saying just now about the food deserts and the real concerns that people have. Um, it's possible when you're traveling this way to touch on some of these controversial issues because you're not addressing them head on, right? The conversation starter is tell me about your trip and you get into it. What are the issues that you're dealing with? Did you find that people were a lot more open with you than you think they might have otherwise been if you had said, I want to come here and do a study on water use and water availability or on the future of wind farms here in the area? Would they talk to you as frankly and openly as they did?
I mean, I didn't run the counter. I didn't run the other example, so I don't know because I didn't do that. But my guess is no. I don't think if I showed up in a car as a researcher for the University of California, Santa Cruz, that many people would have talked to me. I think people were very interested. It was always an opening. You know, how did you get here? What road did you take? You know, and then I knew about the road. Like I learned a lot about gravel roads. I could go on for hours about the kinds of rocks and how they maintain the road and also the environmental struggles over that. Are you getting your rock from the river bottoms? There are these little fish called the Topeka shiners who are being protected in Kansas. And so people used to be able to take, you know, the rocks out of the river creeks, now can't. And so, you know, some people are pissed about that. And, you know, so I'm spending a lot of time staring at the rock, and also in Kansas, in the Flint Hills. It's called the Flint Hills because there's flint. And flint and bike tires and bike like rubber, they don't go well together. The last big ride I did ended with a huge gash in my tire. I thought I was prepared to fix any type of tire, problem, but I wasn't going to fix this. It was an inch long slash. I didn't have a big enough patch.
Well, I
And
hope you had a spare tire as well as inner
no,
tube.
yes. So I was riding tubeless, and did I have a spare? Did I have a spare tube? No, I didn't have a spare tire is the problem. So I had a spare tube, but not a spare tire, and that was something. Do you travel with spare tires?
Sometimes. The
Because
fold-up ones, right?
yeah, so then that made me think I need to start traveling with spare tires. Or in this case, fortunately, like the nearest town was 5 miles away, and there are about 60 people who live in that town. But I know 20 of them. So I called one of them and they came and got me. So local connections also help. Building relations, with people helps. But I now am rethinking this issue, Steve, about shall I bring extra tires with me?
It might, pay off. If you have an extra tire with you, I bet you won't have tire damage like you did,
Probably not.
right?
It's like
Because you won't.
bringing the umbrella when, anyways.
But related to sort of all of the questions that people start to ask, somebody just asked how many miles a day you average when you're on the road like this. I think that's interesting for people to know
Yeah.
too, to get a sense of, how quickly or how slowly one's moving and how much one can take in.
It really varies. I try to, I think on the longest day in Germany, it was 78 miles, and in Kansas, probably about the same. That's probably about as 70 miles is probably the most I would travel. It really depends on the weather. If it's really hot, one of the issues is, having to get up early enough, often before the break of dawn, because biking in the heat is, people think, oh, it's flat. Kansas is flat. It's easy to bike in Kansas. No, it's really hot. It's really windy. It's actually not flat. So it depends on the conditions. I would say on average 40 miles a day was what I was doing. It also really depends on where are their towns, where do I know people. Sometimes I'm forced to go further because, that's the next place where there's somewhere to stay. So it highly varies, but I would say anywhere from 30 to 60 miles in a day would be what I'm averaging.
And I know that Dale was sort of trying to tease this out a little bit. Sort of it's funny in a way that you're actually in Germany right now and the rest of us are all in the US, but we're having this transatlantic conversation. But I think both, for the work that Dale has been doing for so many years for Northern Virginia, but also much of the work that the American Friends of Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, as well as the American Council on Germany do, is we try to look for ways in which Germans and Americans can develop policy recommendations or find solutions for common challenges. And what I think is so interesting about this conversation that we're having today is, the German piece, the American piece, they're important for all of us, right, who are participating in this. But really, what's at the core is what are the challenges that local communities are facing in both countries, and where do they have something in common? They don't always have something in common. I mean, I think anybody that looks at migration in Germany and migration in the US and immigration policy, you can't make one-to-one comparisons. Yes, there are some similar challenges, but it would be a mistake to make one-to-one comparisons. But having said that, I think in many of these areas, there are lessons that can be learned in terms of how different communities are approaching some of these challenges. As sort of an observer who's passed through and taken in what community responses have been like in communities in Germany and the US, can you think of any sort of low-hanging fruit where you would say, oh, definitely a connection should be made there, or even a case where you would say this is something where Americans have learned from Germans or vice versa?
I mean, I think, one of the things that brought people together in Kansas in ways that I think was not possible before, and may also be the case here in Germany, is that fundamental issues like water, are now crucial political issues. Issues like, where are we going to get our energy from? These basic fundamental issues are ones that affect everybody's life. And it allows, when you get down to it, you can have all kinds of differences, but everyone needs clean water. Everyone wants energy. And I think that, and there's also increasingly a question of who belongs in places, and the pressure on local communities, the questions around immigration. These sorts of questions are common across, I think, many places, including, in Germany and definitely in Kansas, and can cut across a lot of differences. So I think that focusing on those kinds of issues can help people find common ground, because they can relate to, and the need for jobs, I mean, that's the other issue is, the common, in Kansas, for example, one real concern is with the death of rural towns, that were, because of high tech, now you have tractors that are being run by machines and AI, and local communities are seeing job losses because of this, and families not coming back, or, farms that had been in families for generations. Now the children are not wanting to come back. Those sorts of issues cut across, the rise of AI, the rise of tech, the big tractors, and all of those things, I think, are issues that cut across these national boundaries, and where there could be very productive, I think, conversations. I think water quality would be, an issue where there's low-hanging fruit. I think it would be interesting to hear what the different, water quality is affected by local conditions. So, for example, in Western Kansas, there's actually a problem of the way the rivers are regulated out there. The draining of the Colorado River has led to leaching of dangerous chemicals into the soil in ways that, it's very specific to that area. So water is being affected by, like, chicken, feces and all kinds of things. It's different depending on where you are, but the issue of water quality being central, and how do we deal with it, and whose responsibility is it? Like in Kansas, we like to blame people in Colorado for that problem. I'm sure that's similar issues here. Like, who takes responsibility for water quality issues? And what kind of a problem is water? Is it that the water is running out? Is it the quality of the water? Is it water ownership issues? I think that would be a fascinating conversation to have across these spaces. Like, I've started to ask people, what is water? Like, and people, at first we're like, that's a funny question. And they're like, but actually, that's a really interesting question. Yeah, what is water? And I think asking those kinds of fundamental, simple questions in different places with different groups of people, you would, I think, learn a lot. And I would love to see, I'm just learning now. I'm spending time here, and I'm going to be here in Munich for 2 months. And I'm looking forward to learning from my colleagues here about what's going on here locally around environmental issues and agriculture. And I'm sure I'll find points of connection, and I would love for there to be this type of exchange, and where our universities and places like the Humboldt can help facilitate those types of exchanges.
Yeah, that sounds great. And I think that, part of it is just compiling that list of, here are all the areas where we can try to track more information, right? I mean, as one sees opportunities, and I think this notion of focusing in on water quality and what that actually means is important. I think Christian wanted to weigh in, and then Dale. I mean, you certainly should not have your role taken away from you. So come back in and pitch some questions.
Well, thank you, Steve. And looking at the time, well, it's flying by. So thank you very much, Jenny. I've learned so much already, and I will definitely, right after our webinar here, I will check out YouTube videos of dancing prairie chickens. You really got me curious there. There is a question I want to share from a Humboldtian. Susan, like Dale, a Buca alum. She was on a Humboldt Fellowship from 1990 to 1991. And Susan asks whether the speakers have insights about local funding for exchanges that Professor Reardon is suggesting. She goes on elaborating that in 1985, she started the Berlin, California Teacher Exchange with some logistical help from the Internationale Lehrerkonferenz. Mostly it was funded by the generosity of the host families on both sides of the Atlantic and a lot of volunteer help for program execution. Well, I would have a bit of an answer before I hand it over to you, Jenny and Dale. I mean, facilitating such exchanges is exactly what American Friends of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation and ACG is what we're trying to do. So when you're a Humboldtian, but not only when you're a Humboldtian, make sure to reach out to us when you are in need of contacts, platforms that we can help build to put such exchanges into practice. But maybe Jenny and Dale, you have additional thoughts for Susan and others who want to promote such and execute such exchanges that Jenny is suggesting.
I mean, there's the short answer, which is that there are some mechanisms. You identified a few, ACG and DAD. I think there's an interesting opportunity, which is that my experience among local governments has been there's two formal institutions which do international engagement, but it is obligated, or it needs to be strategic, needs a prioritization process. First is economic development, the second is education. A lot of the large cities, Kansas City, Portland, they all have global economic development offices, and then the school districts have global education, global languages. And I think if they could just see that there's this long-term history of pedagogical exchange, the roots of K through 12, also the modern academic institution, go back to Germany. There are ways in which we could say, okay, guess what? We have this need for next generation of career technical education workers, things that, Steve and his organization through our friend Rob have been doing for decades. I think that's sort of like the goose that could be the golden egg, which is, there's this wonderful mature set of institutional relations on universities, DAD, but there's this need, I think, to get school districts aware of, look, here's a way in which you can cultivate apprenticeships through the presence of German firms in Silicon Valley, like SAP. Doesn't have to be necessarily the college track, but here are ways in which this could turn into the next generation of digitally skilled workers that can, help make our data centers more energy efficient. I think that is one way of sort of structuring it, but just saying, look, here's carved a proposal that looks for conducting an exchange, not for the sake of conducting an exchange, but links the output of transferring the experiences of something like the dual system to a school district in, LA, Bakersfield, Silicon Valley, Sacramento.
And I think putting a problem at the center of it, like a common problem, like what do we do about the problem of data centers, gobbling up energy and the environmental issues around that, which is common across these two places, could be a way to focus things too. And something that I think governments are really interested in are these types of problems that link both to economics, but also to environmental issues. So a problem-based approach to the conversations. What is the common problem across these spaces? And I'd be super interested to explore those ideas with people. I would love to see these. Again, I'd love to see this happen through education and students at the, and experiencing, because we hear so much, as Dale, as you were mentioning, so much doom and gloom, right now. A sense that the opportunities of this generation are less than previous generations. So one of the things I've been really interested in is how do we keep that sense of adventure, that sense of the world as a place of possibilities alive. And I think that biking is one way to do it. And, make it simple, make it easy, make it fun, and make it important, so that's, I think, something that I think can be that helps make these things possible. And whenever, I would show up somewhere, everyone always said, why are you here? Like, how did you get here? Like there's just this basic curiosity that people have, a desire to connect, no one said you shouldn't be here. Everyone was like curious about how I got here and wanted to make a connection. And I think if we can just keep to those basic, human needs and feelings, start there, start in those places that are not the doom, the gloom. Yes, we have big problems, but let's start from a place where people feel alive and interested and have a space of care for one another.
Well, thank you. Before I hand back over to you, Dale and Steve, for the final words, I just want to point out another comment from the Q&A section. Not a question per se, but a note for Jenny in case she wants to connect. I biked along the German, not me, but Kerstin Lange biked along the German section of the former Iron Curtain, wrote a book about the societal and ecological echoes, and she's giving a presentation about it in the Wendland next Sunday. There's her contact info.
Hey.
She thanks for your engaging talk and the conversation and sends her best from Vermont. So just wanted to build that bridge, and let's say back to you, Mr. Moderator, Dale.
I just want to say thank you, Jenny, so much for responding to my initial email back in January. Thanks for your writing. Thanks to Steve, Christian, Ilanka, and the team at the American Friends. I hope that we can do this again next year, because I plan to take a bike trip now.
Awesome.
So Dale has become a convert. That is great. No, I think I certainly have felt like cycling is a great way to travel because it's faster than hiking. You can cover more ground than on foot, but it's slow enough so that you can have some of the kinds of experiences that Jenny was talking about and really meet people that you wouldn't meet under other circumstances and have conversations that are sometimes not comfortable, but they are important learning experiences that you have along the way. Jenny, I thought your description about, some of the challenges of just dealing with some of the roads and some of the paths and some of the travel certainly resonate. It's not necessarily an easy way to get around, but it's one that can be incredibly eye-opening on multiple levels. I too want to thank everybody for putting this together. It's always great to partner with the American Friends of the Alexander von Humboldt Stiftung, and it's always great to work with Dale, who's an old friend. And so this has been a real honor and a privilege for me personally, but also for the ACG. I very much look forward to more collaboration with all of you. And I guess, Jenny, even though we're thanking you, I want to give you the last word because the question that came in just under the gun before we close things out, I think is a really good one. One of our viewers writes, "Can you tell a brief bike lesson that you learned?" Which you can interpret any way that you want. I thought your tire story was a very good one, but how does cycling help with problem solving?
How does cycling help with problem
Maybe.
solving? Well, I mean, I think that, people open up and when I think of the bike as a diplomat. I think there's a kind of diplomacy that comes from a bike. There's a charisma. There's the bike as a charismatic partner. I think there's a great novel called The Third Policeman. I don't know if anybody knows it. It's a cult book about biking. And over the course of the book, the bike becomes more human and the human becomes more bike. And the bike like wants to be in the living room and the human starts leaning against walls. And I think of my experience, my bike that I have, my bikes have names. There's Brixie, and then there's Whiskey. Whiskey's in Kansas, Brixie's in Germany. And I think of it as a collaboration between me and the bike. I eat for both of us. I think of it as a relation, and we're a team, right? And so I think don't instrumentalize your bike. Like it's your companion, and it's building worlds with you. So that's what I'll end with.
And I love that notion of bike diplomacy. One of the things that Christian and I were talking about before we got started was science diplomacy, and that's certainly something that Dale and I have talked about in the past. But to think about different ways in which we can engage in dialogue and in conversation and develop a deeper, more nuanced understanding about the world around us, the better. And if bicycles can help us do that, that's a great add-on as well. It's my task to close things out. So I just want to say once again, thanks to everybody who worked on putting this together. Thanks for the great partnerships that exist and that can be built on. But more than anything else, Jenny and Dale, thank you for a really inspiring conversation today. This was wonderful.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's been great.